welcome to Chapter 2. In our opening chapter, we discussed Native Americans and new arrivals to our country and the path they need to take in order to become integrated members of our society. The focus was on a popular view of assimilation that generally took 3 generations. During that time, a newcomer group is said to slowly lose their attachment to their native culture and way of life and embrace the American culture and traditions. We also talked about exceptions and how some groups managed to hang on to various elements of their culture or experienced a resurgence of interest that led them back to their cultural heritage. We looked at how the traditional 3-generation theory stacked up against models put forth by Park and Gordon. What it boils down to is that as time goes by, differences between groups tend to fade and they are more likely to be assimilated because their values and norms become more alike. So there is consensus and order as differences decline. This is why assimilation theories are referred to as consensus or order theories. Consensus or order theories are different from conflict theories. Conflict theories generally hold true for groups that come to the country involuntarily, such as via slavery or conquest. In such cases, if a group is involuntarily included for 3 or more generations, there is likely to be an increasing amount of tension and hostility between the groups. This slide shows 4 different reasons why conflict theorists attack assimilation. Not attending to the power differences between the groups, treating assimilation as if it is a desirable goal, acting as if assimilation can be applicable to those who are here involuntarily, and finally, requiring individuals to abandon their culture and heritage. These conditions certainly do not lead to the fading of differences over generations, and certainly are not conducive to consensus or order. Our nation's history was one of expansion and domination. Manifest destiny widened the borders of the original 13 colonies from coast to coast as territories were added to the United States. Indigenous people were forced to live among the English and conform to their norms and values, or retreat into land that the English did not inhabit. As power and influence of the English began to grow along the East Coast, they began to see themselves as Americans or even natives. They also began to draw greater distinction between themselves and more recent arrivals, referring to them as foreigners. Because there was considerable cultural diversity, they were no longer identical culturally to the English, although the language, the social and legal structures were English. They saw themselves as Americans. The subsequent passages in our textbooks outline several processes of assimilation proposed by Gordon. The first of these are cultural assimilation by substitution and cultural assimilation by addition. Cultural assimilation by substitution is where a culture allows their cultural ways of life to fade while adapting to and embracing those of the new society. Their old culture is being substituted with the new one. Cultural assimilation by addition is where a group keeps elements of their own heritage and adds elements of the new culture. Gordon tells us that the total merging of one group with another requires a bit more than what we've discussed so far. He refers to primary structural assimilation and secondary structural assimilation. Primary structural assimilation is about interactions between the subordinate and dominant group that are close and personal. These interactions occur in a private sphere. Such interactions as that occur in a more public sphere, Gordon refers to as secondary structural relationships. These occur in more public settings such as schools, clubs, and such. The latter usually comes about more quickly. Marital assimilation is pretty much a no-brainer. It occurs as members of the groups intermarry. This would have to involve members of the dominant group intermarrying members of the subordinate group. Identificational assimilation occurs when members of both the dominant and the subordinate group see the minority group as part of the majority group. This is difficult since many groups who arrive from other countries may continue to identify with those countries and their cultures for a good number of generations. Gordon goes on to tell us that the persistence of prejudice against a group or its members is a major red flag indicating that that group has not fully merged. Prejudice is a difficult barrier to overcome and may keep a group or its members from assimilating for generations. This slide shows 3 other sub-processes that might be important to know. Our authors go on to tell us in this section that sub-processes do not follow a concrete sequence, nor do they necessarily occur one after the other. They may possibly occur concurrently and progress at various rates. Sub-processes higher on the list, they tell us, should occur more rapidly than those lower. We are also told that all of the sub-processes are not required for assimilation to occur. Varying contexts will lead to assimilation at various points, and all of the sub-processes may not take place. Gordon does assert that assimilation is not actually inevitable. A group may complete several of the sub-processes and still not fully merge with the mainstream. Gordon cites the formation of primary group relations as key since it facilitates progression to other processes and eventually to full assimilation. Our authors next pose 3 ideologies of assimilation that merit examination. The first of these is the Anglo-conformity ideology. This ideology presents a set of goals or standards set by the Anglo-majority, which groups are required to achieve either by choice or not. In this ideology, the expectation is that the outgroups will substitute their own cultures and values for those of the Anglo-majority. Minority group members readily lose all or most of their native culture and, via secondary assimilation, make advances in education, civic, and other activities while participating little or not at all in the activities of their own cultural group. The process continues through the various sub-processes of assimilation until ethnic prejudice and discrimination are minimized and conflicts over value and power no longer exist. The authors do note that in this model, assimilation occurs by substitution of the Anglo culture rather than by its addition. The melting pot ideology is one that most of us are familiar with. It calls for every group to blend in with the majority group and create a new culture altogether. All groups in America should become alike, and the host culture will also be influenced by the culture of the minority groups. This is in keeping with the whole e pluribus unum mentality and is the opposite of the salad bowl metaphor, where the differences of each group bring flavor and richness to the whole. Horace Callan is credited with first introducing the idea of cultural pluralism. The ideology proposes that participation in American society does not require minority groups to surrender or abandon their ethnic heritage. Under this model, cultural assimilation occurs while the minority group retains a good portion of their cultural traditions and values. They also advance in education, occupations, etc., via structural assimilation, while primary assimilation remains low. The minority group may also exhibit a tendency to marry within their own group and retain a sense of pride in their ethnicity. Discrimination and prejudice are minimal, and both majority and minority groups fare equally in terms of civil standing and power issues, with conflicts settled via negotiation within the legal and political framework. Our authors next present us with an anti-assimilationist view that focuses on the fact that the courts and political arenas do not always settle conflicts over power and values that might arise between the majority and minority groups, especially in situations where a group is being forced to enter a society. We are introduced to Blauner's internal colonialism theory. As mentioned before, Blauner emphasizes the plight of groups that are coerced into entering a society, citing black slaves as an example. They came involuntarily and had little in common with other immigrant groups in the United States. They didn't consider themselves as immigrants and rarely merged with the majority group. Our authors cite American Indians, Mexican Americans, and African Americans as examples of the colonial model proposed by Blauner. Next, we examine two theories that are anti-assimilationist and represent models of pluralism that are based on higher degrees of separation from the majority. These are separatism and secessionism. They are pretty much self-explanatory. The intent is strictly to separate the minority groups from the majority in cultural, public, and social arenas. Minority groups conform to the separatist model when they exhibit a low degree of cultural and secondary assimilation. They cling to their cultural identity and generally keep to themselves in the public sphere. They also keep their close relationships within their own group and rarely marry outside. Discrimination and conflict are continuous issues as well. Secessionism occurs when there are separate institutions, economies, and even autonomous regions where the groups may live and interact. Our authors tell us that Anglo-conformity has held sway within the Anglo-American majority, citing examples of how the English culture became the Anglo-American culture with influences from Native American, African, Dutch, and other groups along the way. This also illustrated how cultural elements from other groups fuse and become incorporated over time, supporting the melting pot ideology. Turner proposed that the Western American frontier created situations where there was no choice for groups but to meld and borrow cultural characteristics from each other. Herberg argued in support of the idea that the melting that occurs in the melting pot actually brings other groups closer to Anglo-conformity. Our authors cite research that points to relatively few changes taking place in the Anglo culture versus other cultures in the melting pot.